let's talk about all of this right now with Zoe Gardner, who is a migration policy expert. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Julia. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you so much for joining us, Zoe. We've also seen today that more than 100 charities involved in this field have written an open letter to the Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, calling for a kind and effective system for those seeking asylum in the UK, after this facility in particular was overwhelmed on Sunday night. A reported 4,000 being housed there at Manston. Initially, it was intended to house just 1,600. It's supposed to be moved on and processed within 24 hours. That's not happening anymore. What would a kind and effective system look like?
Well, I think, first of all, I think the people of this country deserve a fair and humane system that processes people quickly. So what we've seen over the last 5 years is that the average time that a person is waiting for a decision on their asylum claim has more than doubled. And on average, an ordinary asylum seeker is waiting for well over a year, just trapped in this asylum system when they're not allowed to work. They're put up in this unsuitable temporary accommodation, sometimes in hotels, sometimes in incredibly poor conditions in these holding centres, as we've discussed. So what we need is resourcing for an asylum system that produces good decisions, fair decisions within a fair and reasonable timeframe. And that should be, targets of a couple of months at most. It's not reasonable to have people piling up, waiting in these awful conditions, and no control over the issue whatsoever from government. Only more and more rhetoric, more and more money thrown at failed deterrence deals with countries overseas. We need a system that works for the people of the UK and for the migrants who are seeking our assistance.
Can I say, what is so appalling about these conditions? I can understand if it's overcrowded, and that's very difficult, and that puts pressure on, toilet facilities and the like. But if we are talking, and we're a civilised, rich nation. We shouldn't. We're not. I don't want people sort of hold as if they're in a sort of a Thai jail or something. This isn't Bangkok. However, what do we mean by this? Because these people are supposedly so desperate, fleeing from war and persecution and the like, that they are willing to risk their lives, paying thousands of pounds to people smugglers to leave a very safe country, France, to having often travelled throughout the whole of Europe to get to France, to pay and to get onto these rickety boats, risking their lives in the Channel to get to this country. And then they're unhappy about their hotel accommodation or being in an asylum centre for a few weeks instead of 24 hours. Gratitude much?
Well, we've just heard just a couple of days ago that there have been outbreaks of scabies and diphtheria in these asylum centres. So we're not talking about a little bit of discomfort. We're talking about an absolutely unacceptable situation. As you say, we're a rich and we are a generous country, but we're also a country that's been struggling in chaos with government completely out of control. No real effective governance for over a year now, really. We've gone through crisis after crisis. And in the meantime, the vulnerable in our societies, including migrants, have been left to suffer, and these systems are crumbling. This is a government that has totally.
But wait a minute, there are tens of thousands of these people who are in hotel accommodation, some 4-star hotel accommodation, 3-star. A lot of people in this country can't afford that. A lot of people from this country who've come here completely legally or have been brought up and raised here, they're not living in such nice accommodation. They couldn't even afford that on holiday. This idea
absolutely, and people should be got out of those hotels. Hotel accommodation for asylum seekers was introduced during the pandemic.
Where do we put them then?
Emergency
measure. Where is all this spare housing? There are people in this country who are born here who haven't got access to decent housing. Why should we prioritise people who come across on dinghies?
We're not talking about prioritising.
Well, we are. If they get a house, someone else doesn't.
One group against another, Julia. When you pit one group
I'm not pitting anyone against anyone. I'm talking about the reality.
The government who has failed to support our communities is the government that has failed to build sufficient affordable housing. It is the government that has sold off our social housing stock. It is not the fault of refugees who are coming seeking protection. A few thousand people can be accommodated humanely in this country. We are perfectly capable of doing it, and the British people want us to do it.
Well, hold on a minute. We have a duty of care to a lot of people feel in terms of people from Ukraine. Many people, and someone in my own buildings, when they're taken in, a mother and child fleeing from Ukraine. A lot of those people we told over the weekend actually that 6-month period that they were going to have these homes or move in with families is up. A lot of people saying that they're facing very, very expensive bills. They can't afford to have people living in their home, and 6 months is a long time to have people living in your spare bedroom, frankly. And they're trying to look for accommodation for those people. Should not women and children fleeing war in Ukraine, should they not take priority over 20-year-old men coming from Albania?
But once again, you're pitting one group of vulnerable people against another.
That's the reality.
No need to do that. The response to the crisis in Ukraine shows how very far ahead of the government our public is. People, as you say, incredibly generously opening up their homes. And now, because of more government failure to get on top of the crisis in our energy markets, the bills that are soaring, the cost of living going up, because of more government failure, that's becoming more difficult for our communities to support.
Everything's a government failure. So people coming to this country is a government failure. Our failure to sort of put them all up in a luxury house is a government failure. Look, we should be building more houses, but we should be building more houses for British people and people who've come here legally, who can add to the nation, who are doctors and nurses and doing jobs that we actually want people to do. The reality is, most people in this country...
You have no idea who these people are.
I am absolutely convinced, Zoe, that the vast majority of 20-year-old Albanian men...
If they weren't being trapped in this housing where they're being targeted now by terrorists, the idea that they should be grateful for being trapped in overcrowded housing where there's the outbreak of disease and being targeted by firebombs is absolutely unacceptable. What you're talking about is a situation where vulnerable people require our help, and we are a generous country and we can provide that help, and government chaos has failed all of our communities.
In what way are these people vulnerable? If somebody has got on a dinghy and paid people traffickers on a French beach thousands of pounds, I think it's around £5,000, isn't it, depending on who you're dealing with, to get onto these dinghies, and you're young and 20-year-old in particular, as we've seen, and it's earlier in the year it wasn't Albanians. Now we've seen, it's not me saying it, it's not the Daily Mail, it's Home Office official in charge of dealing with this who says there's been an exponential rise, and now vast majority of people who are coming from Albania, young men. They think up to 1 or 2% of the young adult male population of Albania has travelled to this country this year. I mean, these are ridiculous numbers. In what way are these people vulnerable?
Actually, the numbers that are ridiculous are the overblown fear-mongering rhetoric, and this does play into a culture where the kind of violent terrorist bomb attack that we saw yesterday can happen. So we should be more careful about how we're talking about these people and how we're talking about whether or not they're welcome here.
Stop, Zoe, stop.
Who people are, to treat them with such hatred and contempt.
Zoe, stop. No one said anything hateful. No one did overblown fear-mongering rhetoric. Nothing I have said isn't a provable fact. Some of it given by Home Office officials.
You are saying that these are overwhelming numbers, but we're talking about 40,000 vulnerable people. In the scheme of the UK, this is absolutely...
I asked you a question.
Simply not overwhelming.
I asked you a question. This isn't a student debate with placards. I asked you a question. In what way are a bunch of 20-year-old Albanian men vulnerable?
Over 50% of Albanian asylum seekers are found to be refugees in this country. They face dangers in terms of trafficking and gang violence. Everybody has the right to seek protection in a country that is safe for them. But I would go further.
But not in France.
Those of them who are not qualifying as refugees also deserve to be treated as humans, and treated as in a respectful debate.
In what way are they not being?
Every single one of those people who gets onto a boat and arrives in Kent is a failure of this government to provide meaningful alternative ways of travel for people who do need protection, and to strike a deal to control the situation in a humane way with our partners.
So your kids must run rings round you if you believe everything. I mean, genuinely, it's absurd. Look, there are definitely people who are fleeing war and persecution, and we have a duty of care. We're a good country. I know we're crowded, but we're not so crowded we can't take these people in. And as you say, we saw this with women and children and people fleeing from Ukraine, again, for a temporary period. People wanted to help them and to take them in. I think this is a good country. I think we want to do well. I just think the vast majority of people in this country, and I'm pretty sure the polls will back me up on this, don't actually buy this idea that people getting into a dinghy on the coast of France are desperate and fleeing persecution. They're in a safe country already. Certainly people leaving Albania. Yes, it's a poorer country. I'm sorry you were born in a poorer country. But yeah, millions of billions of people on this planet are born in poorer countries than most of Europe. But we don't have a duty of care to every single one of them. It's a European country, a NATO country. It's applying to join the EU. It's not at war. It may not be the most wonderful country to live in, but we don't have a duty of care. It's not our government's failure. Plenty of failures by this government.
I think.
But why do you think it's our government's failure? Because these people are in an overcrowded migrant centre. They've chosen to come here.
I think that the British public does believe that we have a duty of care towards humanity and towards working towards a more equal world. And so you say, oh, I'm very sorry, too bad you were born somewhere poor.
Yeah.
What about the people who are starving to death in drought in Somalia? While they're in Somalia and starving to death, we have sympathy for them. But apparently, if they get on a boat and try to save themselves and ask for our help, they're no longer sympathetic. Why would that be? I don't believe that that's how the British
those are two completely different things. Sending aid and making sure these people can have enough to eat and live a decent life, and helping to build. I personally, again, let's help them build up their society so they don't deal with those situations. But saying, oh no, you've got a problem in your country, come over here and live in our country. No, that's not the solution, and that's not what most British people want to happen.
The reality is that most British people do support protecting refugees.
But not,
we receive
not
the way that the international refugee system works is that we all receive a small number, all of us rich countries who have signed up to this agreement to say that we will protect people fleeing persecution. Each of us receive a small number that we are perfectly able to cope with, and each of us then offer protection to those people
we're not able to cope with the number we've got.
Fled persecution. Why should France have to take on all of the burden just because we're geographically located to the west? It doesn't make any sense.
France chose to have open borders. France, if France is crazy enough to have open borders, that's their choice. One of the reasons I wanted us to leave the EU was that we get to choose who comes to our country and who doesn't.
And it's working out brilliantly, isn't it? Because we scrapped the deals that we did have to control our border with France. And so now, instead of having a system whereby people who have family members in the UK who are in France and wish to seek asylum in the UK can cross over under the Dublin system, which was an EU legislation, and people who come here who do not have those connections can be returned to France, now we no longer have those systems. And now we have people crossing the channel,
we could have that if the French...
So we do need to.
If the French and the British governments wanted to have that system and it was mutually compatible, then we would have it. Brexit, it's fascinating.
So you just live in a fantasy world where you can say, well, France can do what it likes and it's nothing to do with us.
Yes, they can. And that's the whole point of being a nation state. And we negotiate deals that are mutually beneficial. That's what you do.
We're talking today because a group of people who were, objectively in an overcrowded facility that had been illegally being kept there for longer than they were supposed to be, were attacked with a firebomb in a terrorist incident.
The wall outside, the fence outside was attacked. I mean, thankfully, no one else was seriously injured. I mean, thank goodness. But we don't know the motive of the person who did this. We still don't know the motive. So let's not. We'll have to leave it there. Time is against us. Zoe Gardner, migration policy expert. Thank you very much indeed.